It was a quiet autumn morning in Palm Springs, California, on October 12, 2012. The kind of peaceful day that lulls you into a false sense of security. In the upscale neighborhood of sprawling mansions and manicured lawns, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. Yet, behind the elegant facade of the Monroe family home, a storm was brewing, one that would rip through the carefully curated lives of Ethan and Victoria Monroe. At 6:45 a.m., the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of police sirens. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows of the pristine homes lining the street. The neighborhood, usually so serene, now buzzed with the sudden rush of law enforcement officers. Their destination was clear: the Monroe residence. The house stood eerily still, its white exterior gleaming under the rising sun. The garden was meticulously kept, a picture of suburban perfection. However, inside, a far darker reality was unfolding, one of deceit, manipulation, and a chilling plot that had been set in motion over the past several years. Ethan Monroe, a man whose past mistakes had haunted him for years, was now at the mercy of his wife, Victoria. Once the perfect couple, their marriage had spiraled into a dangerous game of control and betrayal. Ethan, a man who had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life after serving time for financial fraud, had found solace in Victoria's beauty and charm. She had convinced him that she was the missing piece to his broken life. But the truth was far darker than Ethan could have ever imagined. Victoria had never loved him the way he loved her. To her, Ethan was nothing more than a pawn, an obstacle standing in the way of her ultimate goal, power and wealth. Behind the charming smile and the affectionate gestures, she had been carefully plotting her next move. While Ethan trusted her implicitly, Victoria had already begun siphoning money from their joint accounts, convincing him that she was managing their finances to secure a brighter future for both of them. But as Ethan handed over more control of their lives, he had no idea that his wife's true intentions had already been set into motion. Her manipulations were subtle, crafted with precision. By the time Ethan had realized the truth, it was almost too late. Victoria wasn't just after money, she wanted complete control over everything they had built together. Ethan was merely a means to an end, a means that she had grown tired of. In the days leading up to this fateful morning, the tension had been mounting. Victoria, cold and calculating, had decided that the only way to achieve her goals was to remove Ethan from the equation entirely. And so, on this crisp October morning, she had made her final move. What Ethan did not know was that his wife had orchestrated the perfect crime, a crime that would leave him shattered and powerless, and ultimately reveal the truth of Victoria's chilling ambition. As the officers surrounded the Monroe residence, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike anything Ethan had ever anticipated. He was about to learn the hard way that the woman he trusted most had been plotting his demise from the very beginning. What was supposed to be a day like any other was about to spiral into chaos, a day that would mark the beginning of an unraveling that no one could have foreseen. Ethan Monroe had always been a man of second chances. His past, marked by a conviction for financial fraud, had left him scarred, both in reputation and in spirit. He had spent years trying to rebuild his life, working tirelessly to prove that he was not defined by his mistakes. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a constant shadow that hung over him, one that seemed to whisper that redemption might be beyond his reach. When Ethan met Victoria in the spring of 2009, it felt like fate had finally smiled upon him. She was everything he had longed for, beautiful, confident, and with an air of mystery that drew him in immediately. They met at a small gathering hosted by mutual friends, a casual encounter that would turn his life upside down. Ethan, who had spent years living in the shadows of his past, saw in Victoria a chance at a new beginning. She was young, vibrant, and her smile could light up any room. She made him feel as though he was worthy of love, something he had not felt in years. Victoria, on the other hand, had a different story. To the outside world, she appeared to be the perfect woman, polished, ambitious, and impeccably put together. But beneath the surface, there was a darker drive at play. Victoria's life had always been about one thing: control. She craved power, the kind of power that came from wealth and influence. And Ethan, with his complicated past, presented the perfect opportunity. From the start, their relationship moved quickly. They were inseparable, spending days and nights together, talking about their hopes and dreams. Ethan poured his heart out to Victoria, sharing the most intimate details of his life, including his time in prison and his struggle to rebuild. In return, Victoria listened intently, offering him unwavering support, making him feel that she accepted him for who he was, flaws and all. But as their bond grew stronger, Victoria began to carefully weave a web of lies. By the summer of 2009, just a few months into their relationship, Victoria had already begun manipulating Ethan, slowly planting seeds of doubt in his mind. She questioned his decisions, subtly suggesting that maybe his past was still holding him back. At first, Ethan didn't see it. He was too wrapped up in the intoxicating love he felt for her, blinded by his desire to prove that he could make things right. But the seeds Victoria planted were taking root. By October 2009, just 2 months after they began dating, Ethan proposed to Victoria. His heart raced with excitement as he dropped to one knee, asking her to be his wife. He believed, in that moment, that she was the one who would help him put his past behind him and build a future. Victoria's acceptance came swiftly, her smile radiant as she said yes. She made him feel as though he had finally found someone who could see beyond his mistakes and love him for who he was. He believed she was his savior, his redemption. But unbeknownst to Ethan, Victoria had already begun her own plan, one that didn't include him as a partner, but as a stepping stone to her ultimate goal. Her affections for Ethan were never genuine. While he poured his heart into the relationship, she quietly began to plot. By the time they were married in February 2010, Victoria had already begun siphoning money from their accounts, claiming she was handling their finances. She knew that the more control she had over their shared assets, the more power she would gain. Ethan trusted her completely, and that was exactly what Victoria needed. As the months passed, Victoria's behavior became increasingly manipulative. She would subtly undermine Ethan's confidence, making him question his own worth and capabilities. She convinced him that she was the better judge of their financial situation, persuading him to transfer the title of their house into her name for safekeeping. Ethan, blinded by love and trust, didn't see the red flags. To him, it was just another way to secure their future together. But in reality, it was one more step in Victoria's elaborate plan to have complete control. By the time summer 2010 rolled around, the cracks in their marriage were beginning to show, but Ethan was too emotionally invested to recognize them. His love for Victoria made him blind to her manipulation, even as she grew more detached and increasingly colder toward him. He still believed that she was the woman he had fallen in love with. He had no idea that the woman he trusted more than anyone was slowly, methodically, preparing to destroy him. Victoria's motivations were driven by one singular goal: independence. She wanted freedom, but not just any kind of freedom. She wanted a life free from the constraints of a husband who, in her mind, had outlived his usefulness. Ethan, the man she had once charmed, had become a burden. His redemption arc was no longer part of her plan. But she couldn't leave him, not yet. Leaving him meant giving up half of what they had built together. Victoria wasn't willing to share. If she wanted it all, she would have to eliminate the one person standing in her way. And so, the stage was set. Ethan had no idea that the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with everything, was about to betray him in the most unimaginable way. What had started as a love story would soon spiral into a nightmare, one where the cost of betrayal would become far higher than either of them could have ever anticipated. As the months passed, the cracks in Ethan and Victoria's marriage began to widen, though Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the true extent of Victoria's betrayal. The facade of their happy life was beginning to crumble under the weight of Victoria's carefully orchestrated manipulation. By the spring of 2011, Victoria had gained a vice-like grip on every aspect of their lives, and the once trusting bond they shared had evolved into a dangerous game of control. Victoria's methods were subtle, like a slow poison seeping into Ethan's mind. She had him wrapped around her finger without him ever suspecting it. Her charming smile and soothing words had always been her greatest weapon, but now, they were used to twist Ethan's emotions and exploit his vulnerabilities. She constantly reminded him of his troubled past, as though his past mistakes, his time in prison, were an inescapable burden that would always define him. Every time Ethan seemed to regain some sense of self-worth, Victoria would pull him back, pushing him to doubt himself, to question his value in the relationship. Her manipulation was systematic and cunning. She would stroke Ethan's ego, praising him for his hard work and dedication, only to subtly undermine him moments later. When Ethan tried to make decisions about their future, Victoria would find a way to suggest that he wasn't qualified, that he didn't understand the intricacies of their finances, or that he was still emotionally damaged by his past. "You're just too kind-hearted," she would say, "you can't see the bigger picture. I'm just trying to help you." And with that, she would take the reins, reassuring him that she was doing it for their future. But the reality was far darker. Victoria wasn't just managing their finances, she was siphoning money from their joint accounts, moving funds to her own secret account that Ethan had no knowledge of. Each time they made a major purchase or financial decision, Victoria would subtly steer the conversation, presenting herself as the expert, as the one who knew best. Ethan, still deeply in love with her, trusted her completely. He saw no reason to question her motives, convinced that she had only the best intentions for both of them. By May 2011, Victoria had successfully manipulated Ethan into believing that the best way to secure their future was for her to have full control of their assets. She told him that transferring the title of their home into her name alone would offer them more financial stability, an argument that Ethan, still scarred by his past mistakes, reluctantly agreed to. She made it seem like it was the logical choice, the right step in ensuring their prosperity. The reality, however, was that it was the final piece in her scheme. She now owned everything. As Victoria grew bolder in her manipulation, she began to subtly plant seeds of doubt in Ethan's mind about their relationship. She would drop hints that maybe he wasn't good enough for her, that perhaps their marriage wasn't as perfect as he believed. "You've changed, Ethan," she would say, "you're not the same man I married. Maybe I deserve someone who can keep up with me." Ethan, already feeling insecure about his past, began to internalize these words. He was no longer sure of his place in the marriage, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing Victoria, the woman who had been his salvation. He tried harder to make things work, even as Victoria pulled further away, emotionally withdrawing from him. But by the summer of 2011, Victoria's true intentions began to take shape. Her desire for independence, her craving for total control, and her unquenchable thirst for wealth had reached a boiling point. She no longer wanted Ethan in her life. He had become a hindrance, a man who could no longer offer her the freedom she craved. Rather than simply leaving him, she had come up with a far more drastic solution: she would have him killed. At first, Victoria considered poisoning Ethan. She researched the most discreet methods of slowly killing someone, ways that would leave no obvious trace, but she quickly realized that it would be too risky. Poison could be traced, and any suspicion would fall directly on her. So, she discarded that plan in favor of something more calculated, more clean. She needed someone who would do the job for her, someone who would eliminate Ethan and leave it looking like a burglary gone wrong. Victoria reached out to a friend who had connections to some shady individuals. This friend knew of a man who could make problems disappear for a price. Victoria was intrigued. She knew this was the only way to achieve her goal without getting caught. The price was steep, but Victoria didn't hesitate. She was ready to pay whatever it took to be rid of Ethan and claim everything for herself. On June 15, 2011, Victoria met with the man who she thought could make her dream come true. He introduced himself as a professional hitman who specialized in discreet jobs like the one she was proposing. They met in a dimly lit, quiet restaurant, far from prying eyes. Victoria was nervous, but she hid it well, her voice steady and controlled as she outlined her plan. She described Ethan's daily routine, the layout of their home, and how she wanted the murder to look like a robbery gone wrong. The man listened carefully, asking for all the details. He wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. Victoria handed him a down payment of $1,200, the first installment of the $7,000 fee they had agreed on. She told him she'd pay the rest after the job was done. With the transaction made, she felt a cold sense of satisfaction. It was as if she was finally in control of her destiny. The man promised to do the job, and Victoria left the meeting with a sense of finality, believing that she was about to get everything she wanted. As June slipped into July, Victoria continued her daily routine, pretending that everything was normal. She told Ethan that she was planning a trip for the two of them, planting seeds of normalcy to keep him unsuspecting. But behind the scenes, she was preparing for the murder. Every detail had been planned to perfection. She knew when Ethan would be home alone, the best time for the job to take place, and how to make sure it looked like a random robbery. By July 18, Victoria handed over the final payment to the hitman, along with a photograph of Ethan for identification. She didn't hesitate, not for a moment. This was the only way. As the days ticked down, Victoria counted the hours until Ethan would be gone forever, her freedom, her wealth, and her control finally within reach. But unbeknownst to her, everything was about to come crashing down. What Victoria thought was a well-executed plan, a perfect crime, would soon unravel in ways she could never have anticipated. The walls were closing in on her, and the law was already one step ahead. By the time summer 2011 arrived, Victoria Monroe's plan had evolved from simple manipulation to something far darker. What had begun as a quest for control and wealth was now an all-consuming obsession. Ethan, her husband, had long outlived his usefulness in her eyes. He had become a burden, a reminder of the life she no longer wanted to lead. With every passing day, Victoria grew more convinced that the only way to move forward, to truly claim the life she envisioned for herself, was to rid herself of Ethan once and for all. Victoria's dissatisfaction with her marriage had reached a boiling point. Ethan, for all his efforts to redeem himself, no longer fit into her perfect picture of the life she wanted. The lavish house, the cars, the money, they were all hers for the taking, but there was one obstacle standing in her way: Ethan. Divorce would mean sharing everything they had built together, but Victoria wasn't willing to compromise. She wanted it all. Every penny, every asset, Ethan would have to go. Rather than leaving him in a conventional way, Victoria decided that she would have to take matters into her own hands. But how could she get rid of him? Poisoning him would be too risky, too obvious. It would take time, and there was always the chance that someone might suspect foul play. No, she needed a cleaner solution, something that wouldn't point directly back to her. Victoria started researching ways to make someone disappear. Her internet history was filled with searches about undetectable poisons, accidents that could be staged, and the best ways to get away with murder. She studied everything from drowning to staging car accidents, but none of it felt right. Each option had a flaw, something that might lead back to her. What she needed was someone who could carry out the plan for her, someone who would take the risk and leave no trace. It was during this period of cold calculation that she confided in a friend. This friend, a person with connections to shady individuals, was the one who introduced her to a man who could solve her problem. A professional who had been involved in similar situations before. Victoria, ever the pragmatic woman, didn't hesitate. She arranged to meet him in a quiet, out-of-the-way restaurant to discuss the details. On June 15, 2011, the meeting took place. Victoria, cold and composed, met with the man who would become the key to her plan. She described Ethan's daily routine in great detail, the times he was most vulnerable, the moments he would be alone in their home. She provided a floor plan of their house, highlighting the best places for the man to stage the robbery and make it appear like an accident. The man listened carefully, taking notes, as Victoria calmly outlined her expectations. The conversation was chilling in its simplicity. Victoria made it clear that she wanted Ethan dead, and she wanted it done quickly and cleanly. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of doubt in her words. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. She had made her decision, and she would stop at nothing to see it through. She handed the man a down payment of $1,200, agreeing to pay the remaining $5,800 once the job was completed. As Victoria left the restaurant, a sense of cold satisfaction washed over her. The plan was in motion, and nothing could stop her now. She was closer than ever to achieving her goal. The weight of her actions didn't seem to faze her. Instead, she felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. She was about to be rid of the one thing that had held her back for so long, the man who had once been the love of her life, now just a hindrance to her desires. For the next few days, Victoria carried on with her life as if nothing had changed. She continued to play the role of the loving wife, even as she counted down the days until her plan would be set into motion. She told Ethan that she was planning a romantic getaway for the two of them once the work settled down. She didn't want him to suspect a thing. To him, their life together appeared perfectly normal, happy, stable, with a future full of possibilities. But behind her facade of affection, Victoria was already preparing for Ethan's murder. By the end of June, Victoria handed over the rest of the details to the hitman, everything he needed to know about Ethan's habits, their home, and the best time for the attack. She also provided a recent photograph of Ethan, just in case. It was a cold, methodical move that left nothing to chance. She had everything planned to perfection. The hitman would strike while Ethan was home alone, making it appear like a random burglary gone wrong. The house would be ransacked, and Ethan would be found dead, the victim of a violent break-in. Victoria, in her mind, had crafted the perfect crime, an escape from the life she no longer wanted, a life of freedom and control. She knew that once Ethan was gone, she would inherit everything. The house, the money, the status, they would all be hers. The thought of it thrilled her. The feeling of liberation was intoxicating, and it seemed like the only thing standing in her way was the passing of time. As July 2011 approached, Victoria's excitement grew. Each day, she ticked off another day on her mental calendar, counting down to the moment when Ethan would be gone and her future would be secure. She wasn't just planning to kill him, she was planning to take everything he had worked for. He would no longer be part of the equation, and Victoria would finally have the life she had always dreamed of. What Victoria didn't know, however, was that the walls were already closing in. The authorities had been keeping a close watch on her, and what she thought was a flawless plan was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. The tension was palpable as the days drew closer to the execution of Victoria Monroe's plot. What had once been a series of calculated thoughts and ideas in her mind was now coming to life. With each passing hour, she felt a mixture of excitement and cold detachment, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold, one where she held all the power. The stage was set, and the man she had married, the man who had once been the center of her world, was about to become an obstacle she could no longer tolerate. Victoria had meticulously orchestrated every detail of the plan. She had arranged for the hitman, a man she believed was the key to her freedom, to eliminate Ethan in a way that would make it look like an ordinary burglary gone wrong. Her mind raced as she finalized the logistics. Ethan's habits were etched into her brain. She knew exactly when he would be home alone, the perfect moment for the hitman to strike. The house was familiar to her like the back of her hand, each room, each piece of furniture, and each lock that would make it seem like the intruder had forcibly entered. Nothing would be left to chance. On June 23, 2011, Victoria made her way to the meeting spot. It was a dimly lit cafe tucked away on the outskirts of Palm Springs, far enough from prying eyes to avoid suspicion. She arrived early, as planned, and sat in a secluded booth by the window. Her mind was sharp, and her heart beat steadily, a calm before the storm. She had done this so many times in her head, each rehearsal making her more confident, more resolute. The man would come, they would finalize the details, and then she would be free. At 8:15 p.m., the man arrived. He wasn't tall, but his presence was commanding. He wore a dark jacket, a cap pulled low over his face to obscure his features. Victoria had only seen him once before, but his professional demeanor had left an impression. He was exactly the kind of person she needed, cold, calculated, and discreet. No emotion, no second thoughts. Just a job to be done. She couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect in her own execution of this plan. Her future depended on it. "Are you ready?" the man asked in a low, even voice, as he sat across from her. His gaze met hers, unblinking. He had no need for pleasantries. This was business. Victoria nodded, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside was a wad of cash, $200 in cash, the first installment of his fee. She had promised him the remaining $5,800 once the job was done, and she made it clear that she would not hesitate to follow through with the full payment. "You know what to do," she said, her voice steady. "Ethan's routine is clear. He will be home alone at 9:30 p.m. on the night of July 2nd. I want you to do it quickly and cleanly. I want it to look like a random break-in, nothing more." The hitman listened carefully, nodding. "Understood. I'll make sure everything looks like a robbery gone wrong. I'll be in and out." Victoria felt a chill run through her, but it wasn't fear, it was the cold excitement of control. She had arranged every detail. Ethan would be dead, and she would walk away with everything they had built together. The plan was foolproof. It would be as though nothing had ever happened, no one would suspect a thing. She handed him the photograph of Ethan she had carefully selected, a recent one that showed his face clearly. "This is the man," she said. "He'll be alone in the house. No one will hear him. Make sure the timing is perfect." The man took the photo, his eyes briefly scanning it before he slid it into his pocket. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he stood, leaving the cafe as quietly as he had entered. Victoria watched him go, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction wash over her. It was finally happening. In just a few short days, Ethan would be gone, and everything she had worked for would be within her grasp. As she walked back to her car, Victoria felt oddly detached, as though the entire situation were unfolding to someone else's script. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now it was just a matter of time. Her heart didn't race, as it might have for someone unaccustomed to such a drastic decision. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of calm, even exhilaration. For the first time in years, she felt in control, the life she had always dreamed of finally coming into focus. However, as Victoria pulled out of the parking lot, heading home to the mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary, she could not shake the nagging feeling that something small but crucial, was slipping through her fingers. But she didn't dwell on it. The plan was set. The hitman had the job in hand, and everything was about to change. The days leading up to July 2nd passed slowly, each one marked by the growing tension of knowing that Ethan's life, and her future, hung in the balance. It was the last piece of the puzzle, and Victoria could almost taste her success. Little did she know, the web she had so carefully constructed was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. The days leading up to July 2nd felt like a blur to Victoria. The plan was now so deeply ingrained in her mind that it had become a part of her daily routine. The excitement of knowing that freedom and power were just within her grasp made her feel invincible. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the storm approaching, went about his day as usual, leaving Victoria to silently count the hours until she could finally rid herself of the man who had once been her husband. But what Victoria didn't know was that while she had been plotting Ethan's death, law enforcement had been quietly working to bring her to justice. The police had been following her every move for weeks. A series of tips, rumors, and strange behavior had caught their attention, leading them to suspect that Victoria might be planning something far more sinister than a mere divorce. The authorities had been tipped off by an informant, someone who knew of Victoria's connection to shady individuals and had overheard her speaking about her dissatisfaction with Ethan. This person had no idea about the full extent of her plans, but they did know one thing: Victoria was not the loving wife she appeared to be. They had heard her mention the possibility of wanting to start over without Ethan, and it didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. A task force was quickly assembled. Surveillance was set up on Victoria's movements. They tracked her phone calls, her online searches, and most importantly, her meetings. The police had already identified the man she had been meeting with, the so-called hitman whom she had hired to carry out the murder. It turned out that the man wasn't a professional criminal at all, but an undercover officer working with the Palm Springs Police Department. The police had been watching Victoria for weeks, gathering enough evidence to make their move. Victoria, unaware that the walls were closing in, continued her plans with an unnerving sense of calm. She spent her days preparing for the moment when Ethan would be gone, when she would take everything. She had no idea that she was under constant surveillance. Her every step, her every word, was being recorded. The sting operation was already in motion, and by the time July 2nd arrived, the police knew they had enough evidence to catch her red-handed. On July 1st, just a day before the planned murder, the undercover officer, posing as the hitman, contacted Victoria again. This time, they met in a quiet, dimly lit parking lot. The conversation was chilling in its casualness. Victoria handed the officer the rest of the money, $200, the final payment for a job that had yet to be completed. They discussed the final details of the crime. She handed him the photograph of Ethan, once again, emphasizing that he would be alone in the house at exactly 9:30 p.m. the following evening. She wanted the job done swiftly and without complications. "I want it clean. No mess. It has to look like an ordinary robbery," Victoria insisted, her tone steady. The officer nodded, though he knew that the only thing truly clean about this plan was the way it was all going to unfold in the hands of the police. The next morning, the sting operation was set into motion. The police, aware of the hitman's identity and location, began preparing for what would be a dramatic turn of events. The plan was simple: they would allow the supposed hitman to follow through with his orders. But instead of Ethan being the victim, it would be Victoria who would fall into the trap. The officers would stage Ethan's murder to make it appear real, using fake blood and carefully planned evidence to make it look like a brutal break-in. Then, they would arrest Victoria as soon as she showed up at the scene. At 6 a.m. on July 2nd, police officers quietly arrived at the Monroe residence, making sure that everything was set in place. They carefully staged the scene inside the house: blood splattered on the walls, furniture overturned, and signs of a forced entry. The officers worked quickly and efficiently, knowing that once the plan was set into motion, there would be no turning back. Ethan was hidden away in a safe location, unaware of what was about to unfold. By 7 a.m., Victoria was contacted by the police. They informed her of the break-in at her home and insisted that she come to the scene immediately. The urgency in their voices was palpable. Victoria, thinking that everything was going according to plan, rushed to the house. She believed that Ethan was dead and that she was about to claim everything. When she arrived at the scene, the site was everything she had imagined, but with a twist. Police cars lined the street, yellow crime scene tape encircled the property, and officers moved quickly, their faces grim. Victoria's eyes widened as she approached the house, her heart racing with the knowledge that everything was about to be hers. An officer stopped her as she reached the door. "There's been a break-in," he explained. Victoria, still in disbelief, stepped closer, her eyes scanning the chaotic scene. The officer continued, "Your husband, he didn't make it." Victoria gasped, clutching her chest, her face crumpling in what she hoped appeared to be sorrow. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she fell to her knees in dramatic fashion, her hands trembling. The officers observed her closely, recording her every reaction. But there was something off about her performance. Her reaction was too calculated, too rehearsed. It was clear to the officers that Victoria was not as surprised or grief-stricken as she pretended to be. By 7:30 a.m., Victoria was escorted to the police station, still believing that everything had gone according to plan. She was calm, collected, as if she were in control of the situation. The officers told her that they needed her assistance with the investigation, and she complied without question. But when she entered the interrogation room, she was met with a shock she never saw coming. The hitman was sitting there, no longer in disguise. It was the undercover officer, who now revealed his true identity. The entire murder plot, from start to finish, had been a setup. Victoria's face drained of color as the weight of her actions hit her. The evidence was overwhelming. The police had recordings of her conversations, photographs of the house, and even the money she had handed over. She was trapped. Victoria had fallen right into the police's trap, and in that moment, she realized that her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. The trap had been set, and she was now the one who was caught in it. What she thought was her perfect crime had become her undoing. The plan had been set into motion flawlessly. The Palm Springs Police Department had worked tirelessly to stage a scene so convincing that even the most seasoned criminal would have been fooled. What Victoria Monroe didn't know was that as she rushed to the scene, believing she was about to inherit everything she had so coldly plotted for, she was walking directly into the trap laid by the very officers she thought she had outsmarted. Inside the Monroe residence, Ethan, unbeknownst to his wife, was hidden away in a safe location. The officers had made sure he would be well out of sight during the staged burglary. The scene was meticulously arranged, broken furniture, shattered glass, and fake blood splattered across the walls and carpet. Every detail was carefully calculated to mirror the chaos of a real home invasion. The only thing missing was the actual victim. Victoria's arrival was timed to perfection. As she approached the crime scene, she was met by a team of officers standing at the edge of the property, ready to carry out their part of the plan. The tension in the air was palpable, but Victoria had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. She believed, with all the certainty in her heart, that the worst had already happened. Ethan was dead, and now, everything she had ever dreamed of, money, freedom, control, was within her reach. As she got closer to the house, her pulse quickened, and her thoughts raced. She had imagined this moment countless times, each time more exhilarating than the last. The police officers, who had already gathered at the scene, watched her intently. They could see her shaking hands and the hint of a smile that flickered on her lips as she approached the house. This was the moment she thought would define her new life, but it would instead be the moment everything crumbled. An officer stepped forward and stopped her just before she could cross the yellow crime scene tape. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you'll need to stay back. There's been a break-in at your residence. It's a crime scene now." The officer's voice was firm but professional, designed to reassure her, but also to keep her at a safe distance from the unfolding drama. Victoria, still in shock, feigned disbelief. "What do you mean? What happened? Where is he? Where's my husband?" Her voice cracked slightly, the panic setting in, but her acting was far from genuine. "There's been a violent break-in, ma'am. We need you to stay here while we process the scene," the officer continued. He was perfectly calm, his eyes trained on her every reaction. As he spoke, he slowly led her toward the entrance, where another officer was waiting to inform her of Ethan's fate. When they reached the threshold, the officer broke the news to her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, looking at her with a level of feigned sympathy. "Your husband didn't make it. He's dead. He was found in the living room." Victoria froze. Her body stiffened as she absorbed the words. A dramatic gasp escaped her lips, and her hands instinctively flew to her chest as if she had been struck. She collapsed to the ground, tears welling in her eyes as she gasped for air. The officers watched carefully, recording her every move, knowing that they were witnessing her performance unfold. To the untrained eye, her reaction might have seemed like that of a grieving wife, overwhelmed with shock and despair. But to the officers who had been following her every move, there was something terribly wrong. The emotional display was too perfect, too rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The coldness behind her eyes was hard to miss. There was no real mourning, just a practiced, hollow expression of grief. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion growing. They had known she was the mastermind, but now it was more apparent than ever that she had planned this murder with cold, calculating precision. And yet, there was still more to come. Victoria, her tears now flowing freely, was escorted into the house, where she discovered the crime scene for herself. The scene before her was chaotic, just as it had been staged. Furniture overturned, glass scattered on the floor, and blood spattered across the walls. The smell of artificial blood filled the air, a scent that mixed with the bitter reality of her situation. Victoria's eyes darted around the room, taking it all in. She did not seem horrified by the carnage before her, but instead, she observed it with a chilling level of calm. She stepped further into the house, her eyes scanning every corner as if she were surveying the results of her own handiwork. It was as if she was looking for something that would confirm that her plan had gone exactly the way she wanted it to. But instead, what Victoria didn't see was the police officer silently stepping into the room behind her. He had been carefully positioned in the shadows, hidden from her view, waiting for the moment when he would finally reveal the truth. As Victoria made her way further into the house, she stopped in front of the spot where Ethan was supposed to have been found. But there was no body. There were only signs of a struggle, a trail of fake blood, and an eerie quiet that filled the room. Before she could process what was happening, the officer stepped forward and said, "Victoria Monroe, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your husband, Ethan Monroe." Victoria's blood ran cold. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in months, a wave of panic surged through her. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice suddenly faltering. "You've been under surveillance, Victoria." "We know everything," the officer continued, his voice unflinching. "You hired a hitman to kill your husband, and we've got all the evidence we need. The plan was already in motion, and you fell right into our trap." The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. The fear she had suppressed, the quiet certainty that she would get away with murder, all came crashing down in an instant. The hitman she thought she had hired, the one she had trusted, was an undercover officer. The police had been watching her every move, documenting every conversation, every plan. She had been caught. Victoria stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then, as the reality of the situation hit her, she felt the weight of the handcuffs as they clicked around her wrists. She had been outsmarted, and there was no escape. Her perfect plan had turned into her perfect downfall. Victoria Monroe sat in the sterile interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows across her face. Her hands were cuffed tightly to the metal chair, the weight of her own actions now fully sinking in. The detective across from her, a man she had never seen before, studied her with an expression that betrayed no emotion. He placed a manila folder on the table in front of her, the sound of the paper sliding across the surface cutting through the tension. "You've been under surveillance for quite some time, Ms. Monroe," the detective said coolly, flipping open the folder. "We have your meetings with the so-called hitman, we have your phone records, and we have your bank transactions. There's no escape from the evidence, and there's no room for doubt. You hired someone to murder your husband." Victoria's mouth went dry. She had hoped, against all logic, that somehow she would escape the consequences of her meticulously crafted plan. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. She had been caught, and there was no denying the damning evidence that was piling up against her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria replied, her voice shaky but still trying to maintain an air of composure. She refused to believe that everything she had worked for could be taken from her so easily. The detective didn't flinch. He pushed a series of photos across the table, each one more damning than the last. There was the photograph of her handing over the down payment to the undercover officer, the recordings of her coldly discussing the murder, and the detailed plans she had outlined for him. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, each moment of calculated deceit laid bare before her. The look in her eyes softened, the weight of her own lies sinking in, but she refused to admit defeat. Over the next few days, the investigation deepened, and Victoria's life was turned upside down. The police had gathered more than enough evidence to charge her with attempted murder, but as the case unfolded, the true extent of her manipulations became apparent. The financial records were even more revealing than anyone had anticipated. The authorities discovered that Victoria had been siphoning large sums of money from their joint accounts for months, a move that was both premeditated and a clear indication of her true motives. Ethan had no idea how deeply he had been deceived. As news of the plot to kill Ethan Monroe broke, the media descended on the case, turning it into a public spectacle. The story of the glamorous, charming woman who had planned to kill her husband for money and control captivated the public. Every detail of her cold, calculated scheme was exposed to the world, and the case became a fixture on news outlets across the country. Journalists speculated about what could drive someone to such extremes, and psychologists weighed in, offering insights into the mind of a woman who appeared to have it all, yet was willing to destroy it all for wealth and power. Ethan, meanwhile, was in shock. The police had informed him of the plot against him, and he was understandably shaken. He had trusted Victoria with everything, and to learn that his wife had been plotting his murder behind his back was a betrayal too painful to fully comprehend. Though he had recovered from his past mistakes and rebuilt his life, this revelation felt like a cruel twist of fate. The emotional toll on him was immeasurable, but he knew he had to do the right thing. He agreed to testify at her trial, his presence an unwavering symbol of the pain and devastation Victoria had caused him. The trial was set for late August 2012, and as the date approached, the atmosphere surrounding the case grew increasingly tense. Victoria's legal team scrambled to mount a defense, arguing that she had been misunderstood, that the entire plot had been some kind of bizarre reality TV stunt gone wrong. Her defense team tried to paint her as a woman trapped in a misguided attempt for fame and fortune, driven by a delusional need for attention. They argued that the police had entrapped her, pushing her into a situation she never would have considered if it weren't for the setup orchestrated by the undercover officer. But the prosecution was ready. They had a mountain of evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Victoria had orchestrated everything herself. The recordings of her discussing how she wanted Ethan dead were chilling, the photos of the transaction for the hitman's payment were clear, and the testimony from the undercover officer who had posed as the hitman was damning. The jury was presented with the full scope of Victoria's manipulation and deceit, from the financial theft to the cold-hearted plotting of her husband's murder. In the courtroom, Victoria sat quietly, her eyes downcast as the prosecution laid out its case. She no longer looked like the woman who had once seemed so sure of her plan. The cracks in her demeanor were evident, but she held on to a thin thread of hope that somehow, the jury would find a way to believe her defense. She knew the evidence was stacked against her, but the possibility of escaping the harsh reality of her actions lingered. The defense tried to paint Victoria as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been pushed into making a desperate decision by a flawed relationship and an even more flawed sense of reality. They questioned the legality of the police's actions, suggesting that Victoria had been coerced into committing the crime she had been accused of. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was simply too strong. By early September, the trial reached its climax. The prosecution delivered its closing arguments, reminding the jury of the chilling coldness with which Victoria had plotted her husband's murder. The final image the jury was left with was that of a woman who had spent months preparing to take a life for money and power, all while pretending to be a loving wife. On September 15, 2012, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Victoria Monroe was found guilty of attempted first-degree murder. The room fell silent as the verdict was read. The weight of it hit her like a freight train, and for the first time in months, Victoria's carefully composed mask cracked. Her face drained of color as she clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. The reality was sinking in, she had lost everything. The judge announced her sentence, 20 years in prison, a fate that would strip her of everything she had worked for. The life of luxury, the power, the control, everything had been taken from her in an instant. As she was led away in handcuffs, Victoria's mind raced. She couldn't believe it had come to this, how her carefully laid plans had unraveled so swiftly. But even as she was escorted out of the courtroom, her legal team immediately filed an appeal, suggesting that media bias and police entrapment had influenced the trial. Victoria's fight for freedom was far from over. The public was left to wonder, was she truly the cold-blooded killer the prosecution had portrayed, or was there more to the story? The legal battles that followed would keep her fate in the headlines for years to come, and the case would remain a dark chapter in the story of a woman who had once seemed to have it all. The courtroom was packed on September 15, 2012. The buzz of hushed conversations, the shuffle of feet, and the rustling of papers created a low hum in the air as the jury filed back into their seats. The gallery was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this moment was coming, but no one could quite predict how it would feel when the weight of justice finally came crashing down. Victoria Monroe, once the epitome of elegance and charm, sat at the defense table, her face pale and tight with anxiety, her hands clenched on the table in front of her. Her carefully controlled demeanor had long since unraveled, replaced by a nervous tension that could no longer be masked. Ethan Monroe sat quietly in the audience, his face a mixture of disbelief and pain. The man who had once loved the woman sitting in the courtroom, the woman who had so brutally betrayed him, was now living through the aftermath of the life he thought he had built. His heart had shattered when the truth was revealed, but the satisfaction of seeing her face justice was bittersweet. This was the moment when his nightmares would end, when the woman who had planned his murder would finally have to face the consequences of her actions. The judge, a stern middle-aged man with a quiet authority, called the room to order. His eyes flicked between Victoria and the jury as he awaited the final decision. The room fell silent as he asked the foreman to read the verdict. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt almost suffocating. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper in front of him. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Victoria Monroe, guilty of attempted first-degree murder," the foreman announced. The words seemed to hang in the air, a weight that seemed to settle onto Victoria's shoulders like a heavy shroud. For a split second, her eyes fluttered, and her breath caught in her throat. The mask of composure she had maintained for so long faltered, and for the first time, the raw emotion beneath the surface leaked through. Her eyes glazed over, and her body stiffened, as if bracing for the inevitable. She had hoped for a different outcome, even as the overwhelming evidence had mounted against her. Now, reality was crashing in, and the fantasy of escaping punishment was slipping through her fingers. The judge nodded solemnly as the foreman finished reading the verdict. The room was still. There was no outcry, no gasps of surprise, just the somber reality of the conviction settling in. Victoria's attorneys exchanged glances, the weight of defeat visible on their faces. They had fought tirelessly, trying to convince the jury that she had been manipulated, that the police had set her up, but the evidence had been too overwhelming. The defense's attempt to portray Victoria as a woman caught up in a misguided reality TV scheme, a pawn in a police trap, had failed to convince anyone. The coldness in her actions, her meticulous planning of Ethan's murder, spoke louder than any words her defense team could offer. As the judge called for a recess before sentencing, Victoria sat motionless, her face pale, her eyes distant. Her attorney leaned in, speaking to her in hushed tones, but she didn't respond. The crushing weight of the decision, the realization that her carefully constructed life was over, was too much for her to process all at once. She had been so sure of her success, so convinced that she would escape justice, that now, facing the reality of her actions, it felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan stood up from his seat, his eyes meeting hers across the room. There was no hatred in his gaze, just sorrow, the kind of sorrow that comes from losing someone you thought you knew, someone you loved, only to realize that they were capable of betrayal beyond comprehension. The moment their eyes locked, there was an understanding between them. He had been her target, her victim, but now, the power was in his hands. The court had delivered justice. The recess ended, and the judge returned to the bench. Victoria, still seated at the defense table, looked like a woman who had been stripped of her dignity. The judge looked at her, his expression impassive, before he turned to address the court. "Victoria Monroe," he began, his voice stern, "you have been found guilty of attempted first-degree murder. The evidence presented in this case shows a cold, calculated plan to end your husband's life for your own gain, for the sole purpose of securing wealth and control over everything he had worked for. Your actions have not only violated the sanctity of marriage, but also the trust and respect that are fundamental to society. You have shown no remorse for the pain you caused, and instead, you have tried to manipulate the system, to use your charm and your lies to escape the consequences." The room was silent as the judge paused, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. There was no sympathy in his gaze, no leniency in his tone. This was a woman who had shown no remorse, whose actions were motivated purely by greed and power. And now, she would face the consequences. "Given the premeditated nature of your crime, the court sentences you to 20 years in prison for attempted first-degree murder. Your sentence will be served in a maximum security facility, and you will be required to pay restitution to your victim, Ethan Monroe, for the emotional and financial damages you caused." As the judge's words echoed in the room, Victoria's face drained of color. The sentence was a life sentence in its own right. 20 years, 2 decades of her life, gone. All the things she had once cherished, the life of wealth and control, were now out of her reach. It wasn't just her freedom that had been taken from her, it was her future, her reputation, and everything she had worked for in the pursuit of power. She was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and expressionless. As she was escorted from the courtroom, there was no more acting, no more false displays of grief. The reality of her situation had settled in. She had lost everything. As the courtroom doors swung closed behind her, Ethan remained seated. He had been through so much, years of rebuilding his life, the shock of betrayal, the weight of fear for his life, but now, at least, there was a sense of finality. Victoria's actions had shattered his world, but today, justice had been served. It wouldn't bring back the years he had lost, but it would give him the closure he needed to move forward with his life. The gavel fell, and the courtroom was left in quiet reflection, the story of betrayal, ambition, and greed finally coming to a close. But for Victoria Monroe, the story was far from over. The battle for her freedom would continue in the form of appeals and retrials, but one thing was certain, she had lost her chance at the life she had once dreamed of. The courtroom doors closed behind Victoria Monroe with the sound of finality. The clang of the heavy metal doors echoed through the hallways, marking the end of a chapter in her life, a chapter that had begun with dreams of power, wealth, and control but had ended in the cold, concrete reality of a prison cell. She had lost everything. The life she had once thought would be her empire was now shattered, her dreams replaced by the bleak and unforgiving walls of a maximum security facility. As the years ticked by, Victoria's name became synonymous with manipulation, greed, and betrayal. The media circus surrounding her case had died down, but the legacy of her actions remained. Every moment of her carefully constructed life, her charm, her beauty, and her seeming perfection, was now exposed for what it truly was, a facade built on lies and deceit. Victoria's story was a cautionary tale, one that would forever remind people of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the destructive power of greed, and the dark corners of human nature where even those we trust most can turn against us. For Ethan, the pain of betrayal would never fully heal. While the legal system had rendered its judgment, the emotional scars he carried were not so easily erased. His life had been upended, turned upside down by the woman he had loved and trusted with his heart. He had spent years trying to rebuild, only to be betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. And yet, as the years passed, Ethan learned to move forward. The justice system had given him the closure he needed, but it was up to him to reclaim his life. He found strength in the support of friends and family, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the knowledge that he had survived a nightmare that so many others never could. Victoria, on the other hand, spent her days behind bars, waiting for the appeals that would come. Her legal team filed motions to reduce her sentence, to argue that the media frenzy had unfairly biased the jury. But every attempt to rewrite her story was met with the same cold truth: she had orchestrated the murder of her husband. There was no escaping the gravity of her actions, no matter how much she tried to deflect the blame or convince herself that she had been coerced or misunderstood. As Victoria spent her days in prison, her hopes of regaining her freedom grew more distant with each passing year. The life of luxury she had once dreamed of was now nothing but a distant memory, as she sat in the same stark, sterile environment day after day, confronting the consequences of her choices. The lavish parties, the grand homes, the control over everything she had once craved, none of it could compare to the bitter taste of regret that now haunted her every waking moment. Her story is a grim reminder of the dangers of manipulation and unchecked ambition, of how the desire for control and power can drive people to do unthinkable things. Victoria Monroe had everything: beauty, wealth, and the adoration of those around her, but it was never enough. The emptiness she felt inside could not be filled with money or possessions. And in the end, the price she paid for her desire was far greater than anything she could have ever imagined. The lesson here is clear: ambition, when driven by greed and a thirst for control, can consume even the most seemingly perfect lives. It can twist relationships, destroy trust, and lead people down a dark path from which there is no return. But it also teaches us that no matter how clever the plan, no matter how carefully laid out the deception, justice has a way of finding its way to the truth. It may take time, but the truth always comes to light. So, what do you think about this story? How do you feel about Victoria's actions and the ultimate consequences she faced? Was justice served, or do you think there was more to her story? What lessons can we learn from her tragic fall from grace? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share your opinion with us. Do you think the consequences were fair? Could there have been another way out for Victoria? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your thoughts and feedback are important to us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you.